Morning my grandson was born, I was in my garden pulling weeds. That sounds peaceful. It wasn't. I was pulling weeds because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. My phone had been silent for 11 hours. My son hadn't called. My daughter-in-law hadn't called. Nobody had called. I found out through Facebook. My neighbor Trudy, sweet woman, means well, absolutely no filter, sent me a screenshot of my son's post at 6:47 in the morning. He's here. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, mom and baby doing great. There was a photo. My grandson, red-faced and squinting at the light, wrapped in a blue hospital blanket. My son's hand, large and familiar, cupping the baby's tiny head. I sat down on the garden steps and just looked at that photo for a long time. Then I went inside, washed my hands, made coffee, and waited for the phone to ring. It didn't ring that day, or the next. My name is Irene. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years as a pediatric nurse, which is its own kind of irony when I tell you the rest of this story. I raised my son Trevor on my own after his father left when Trevor was 9. We didn't have much. I picked up extra shifts, I clipped coupons, I drove a car with a cracked dashboard for 6 years because I couldn't afford to replace it. But Trevor went to a good school. Trevor played soccer. Trevor had birthday parties and summer camp, and, eventually, a college education that I co-signed loans for and helped pay down every month until I was 58 years old. I tell you this not for sympathy. I tell you this not for sympathy. I tell you this so you understand what I thought we were to each other. When Trevor was 28, he met Brianna at a work conference in Phoenix. She was sharp, ambitious, pretty in a polished way that made me think of magazine covers. She called me Irene from the very first meeting, which, I know this sounds small, felt like a door closing quietly in my face. I told myself I was being old-fashioned. I told myself a lot of things in those early years. They moved in together after 4 months, engaged after 8. I found out about the engagement when Trevor called me, excited and nervous, and I cried and asked to see the ring and offered to host a dinner. Brianna wanted to have the celebration at her parents' place in Scottsdale instead. Fine, of course. Her parents were lovely people. Her father, Owen, was an orthodontist. Her mother, Patrice, had the kind of easy grace that comes from never having had to worry too much about money. They were kind to me at that dinner, genuine, I think, but I felt sitting at their long table with the good silverware like a guest who had arrived at the wrong party. The wedding planning happened, mostly without me. I was consulted on my dress color. Something in dusty rose would be beautiful, Irene, and asked to write a check toward the rehearsal dinner. I wrote the check. I wore dusty rose. I sat in the third row because the front 2 were for Brianna's family, and I smiled in every photograph, and I danced with my son at the reception and told him I loved him and meant it completely. What I didn't know then was that this was the high point, that things would only become more managed, more distant, more carefully arranged to keep me at exactly the right amount of arm's length. After the wedding, Brianna went back to school for her MBA. Trevor got a promotion. They bought a house in a suburb of Denver I'd never heard of. 45 minutes from the airport. I visited twice a year, always in the guest room that also served as Brianna's home office, my suitcase wedged between her desk and a treadmill. I learned not to open the refrigerator without asking. I learned not to suggest activities. I learned that my role on these visits was to be pleasant, low maintenance, and brief. Then Brianna got pregnant, and everything I thought I'd accepted fell apart at the seams. I called the week they announced it, practically tripping over my words with excitement. I offered to fly out for any of the appointments, the anatomy scan, the 3rd trimester, whatever would be helpful. Brianna said she'd let me know. Trevor echoed it. We'll figure out the timing, Mom, in the careful, slightly flattened tone he'd developed over the years, the voice he used when he was repeating something Brianna had already said to him in private. Months passed. I sent a care package at the start of the 2nd trimester. Good tea, a heating pad, a few things I knew from nursing would help with the discomfort. I got a 2-line text thanking me. I called on Brianna's birthday and left a voicemail. She texted back a smiley face. When Brianna was 7 months along, I asked directly, when should I plan to come? I'd love to be there for the first week, help out however I can. There was a pause on the line, that specific pause I'd learned to dread, and then Trevor said, Brianna wants it to be just us at first. We'll call you when we're ready. I asked how long at first meant. He didn't know. The baby came on a Tuesday. I learned about it on Wednesday morning through a Facebook post and a neighbor's screenshot. I waited 3 more days. Then I called Trevor. I saw the announcement, I said. Congratulations. How is everyone? Great, he said. He's great. Brianna's tired but doing well. I'd love to come meet him. Another pause. We're still figuring out the schedule. Trevor. I kept my voice steady. I'd had a lot of practice. He's my grandchild. I found out he was born through Facebook. I would like to meet him. There was a longer pause this time. And then, in a quieter voice, Trevor said, Brianna's mom is here right now. Maybe in a few weeks? I said okay. I hung up. I sat in my kitchen and looked at the wall for a while. Then I called my accountant. Now I need to explain something. 2 years before all of this, I'd made a decision I hadn't told Trevor about yet. When I retired from nursing, I took my pension and my savings, and with some guidance from a financial advisor I trusted, I'd invested in a small commercial property, a little strip of storefronts in the town where I'd lived for 30 years. Nothing dramatic. A tax strategy, mostly, and a way to generate some income in retirement. One of the storefronts I kept empty, thinking I might open something small someday. A little cafe, maybe. Something to do with my hands. The property was worth considerably more than Trevor knew, more than most people in my life knew, honestly. I am a private person about money. It is a habit from years of not having very much of it. My accountant, a pragmatic woman named Susan who has known me for 15 years, listened to everything I told her. Then she said, Do you want to change the estate documents? I thought about it for a week. During that week, Trevor called once to send a photo. My grandson sleeping, impossibly small, in a onesie with ducks on it. I saved it immediately and looked at it probably 40 times. I want to be honest about that. I was not angry at that baby. I was not angry at Brianna in the simple way people sometimes assume. What I felt was more complicated than anger. It was grief, and it was clarity, arriving at the same time. The following Tuesday, Brianna called me. I was surprised enough that I almost didn't answer. She was cheerful, practiced, the voice she used when she wanted something. Irene, I've been meaning to call. How are you? We did 3 minutes of pleasantries, and then she got to it. So we're actually thinking about opening a small business, she said. A consulting practice. Trevor's going to leave his job and we're going to build it together. We're really excited. I said that sounded like a big step. It is, she agreed. And we've been looking at startup costs. And honestly, we think the best path forward is to use the equity in our house plus some investment from family. A brief pause. We were hoping you might consider lending us a significant amount to get us started. We could put together a formal agreement. I set down my coffee cup very carefully on the counter. How much, I said, were you thinking? She named a number. It was not a small number. It was, in fact, nearly the entirety of what she likely imagined my savings to be. She'd clearly made some calculations based on a nursing salary and a modest retirement. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew, was the property. What she didn't know was that I had already, the week prior, quietly updated my estate plan. That's a significant ask, I said. We know, Brianna said warmly. But family invests in family, right? And you've always wanted to be more involved in Trevor's life. I let that land. I let it sit there between us for a moment. Brianna, I said, my grandson is 3 weeks old. I have not held him yet. I was not called when he was born. I found out he existed through a Facebook post. I paused. And now you're calling to ask me for money. The warmth drained out of her voice like water from a tub. We thought you'd want to support Trevor's dream. I want to meet my grandchild, I said. When can I come? She said she'd talk to Trevor and get back to me. She did not get back to me. What happened next? I did not plan in advance. I want to be clear about that. I am not by nature a dramatic person. I spent 31 years in pediatric nursing. I have held the hands of parents in waiting rooms, and I have learned that there is very little in life that is improved by performance. What I did quietly. And I did it because I finally stopped waiting for circumstances to change themselves. I reached out to Owen and Patrice, Brianna's parents. I called Patrice on a Wednesday afternoon and I was honest with her. I told her I hadn't met my grandson yet. I told her about the phone call. I told her I wasn't calling to cause problems, but because I was genuinely at a loss. Patrice was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Oh, Irene," just that. 2 words. The way she said them told me she was not entirely surprised. "How is he?" I asked. "The baby. Is he healthy?" "He's beautiful," Patrice said. She sounded tired. "He looks like Trevor." We talked for 40 minutes. She didn't make me any promises, but 3 days later, Trevor called me and said stiffly, rehearsed, that they'd like me to come the following weekend. I booked my flight before we hung up. The visit was careful. Everything was careful. Brianna was polite in the specific way that costs a person something to maintain. Trevor was warm in the moments when she wasn't watching and then muted again when she was. But I held my grandson. I held him for a long time, sitting in the chair by the window, and I did not think about any of the rest of it for those minutes. He wrapped his hand around my finger and I thought, "There you are. I've been waiting for you." I did not bring up the loan. Brianna did not bring it up either. On the second day, while Brianna was napping, Trevor sat across from me at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, and for the first time in years, he looked like the boy I used to know. Uncertain. A little young. "Mom," he said, "I know things have been." He stopped. Started again. "I know it hasn't been the way it should be." "No," I agreed, "it hasn't. Brianna has a lot of anxiety about family involvement. Her childhood was complicated." "I understand anxiety," I said. "I spent my career in pediatric nursing, Trevor. I understand that people have histories. But understanding someone's history doesn't mean accepting behavior that causes harm." He looked at the table. "I am your mother," I said. "I found out my grandson was born through Facebook. That is not a small thing. And then I was asked for a very large amount of money." I watched his face. "Did you know she was going to ask me that?" He didn't answer for a moment. Then I knew she was going to bring it up. "Were you going to call me regardless, if she hadn't needed the money?" He was quiet for long enough that I had my answer. I reached across the table and put my hand over his. "I love you," I said. "I am not going anywhere. But I need you to understand that I'm not a resource to be managed. I'm your mother." He nodded. He didn't say much. But when I left on Sunday, he hugged me at the airport for a long time, long enough that Brianna, standing a few feet away with the stroller, glanced over twice. What I did when I got home was not revenge. I want to be precise about that word, because people use it when what they really mean is accountability. I called Susan and I finalized the estate documents. The property, the storefronts, the investment account, all of it went into a trust. The trust had one primary beneficiary, my grandson. Not Trevor and Brianna jointly, as it had been before. My grandson, with stipulations about age and independent legal oversight, and with a provision that Trevor would serve as trustee only under specific conditions related to our relationship, conditions that a family attorney had helped me articulate carefully and legally. I also, and this part matters, wrote Trevor a letter. Not an email. A letter on paper, which I mailed to his house. It was 4 pages long. I told him the history I've told you here, but in more detail and without the self-editing. I told him what it felt like to find out on Facebook. I told him what it felt like to be asked for money before I'd been asked to visit. I told him what I had changed in my estate plan and exactly why. I told him I loved him and that my door would always be open, and that I hoped deeply that we would find our way to something real before it was too late. I did not tell Brianna. That was intentional. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Trevor called me on Saturday. He was crying, which I had not heard since he was 19 and his dog died. We talked for 2 hours. It was the most honest conversation we'd had in a decade. He told me things about his marriage I hadn't known. I told him things about his marriage I hadn't known. I told him things about my loneliness I hadn't said out loud. Neither of us solved anything in that phone call, but something opened. Something that had been sealed for a long time. Brianna, from what Trevor has told me since, was furious about the estate changes. She called it manipulation. She called it controlling. She said I was punishing them. Trevor, for the first time in their marriage, apparently said, she found out her grandson was born through Facebook, Brianna, and then you called her for money. I don't know exactly what happened after that. Trevor has been careful about what he shares, which I respect. What I know is that they started couples counseling in October. What I know is that at Thanksgiving, Brianna looked at me across the table with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not warm, not hostile, somewhere complicated in between, and said, "He really does look like Trevor, doesn't he?" About the baby. "He does," I said. "He has your eyes, though." She looked surprised. Then she almost smiled. I don't know where this ends. I'm not naive enough at 64 to believe that one honest letter and one honest phone call reweaves 30 years of complicated family fabric. But I know that my grandson knows my face now. I know that I was there for his first Christmas. I know that last week Trevor called me on a Tuesday for no reason other than to tell me the baby had laughed for the first time. A real laugh. And that it sounded ridiculous and wonderful, and he wanted me to know. He called me first, not Facebook. Me. I am still working on that little cafe. I've hired a contractor, picked out the tile, argued happily with my friend Donna about what to put on the menu. It will open in the spring, if everything goes according to plan. I'm thinking of naming it after something small and sturdy, something that grows back even after hard winters. I was in the garden this morning pulling weeds. My phone rang. It was Trevor, the baby fussing in the background, wanting to know if I had a good recipe for the chicken soup his grandmother used to make. I do, I told him. Come for the weekend and I'll show you. He said they'd be there Saturday. I've thought a lot about what actually changed things. Not the estate documents. Those were a consequence, not a cause. Not the letter, exactly. Though the letter cracked something open. What changed things was the moment I stopped waiting for my son to choose me and started being honest about what I needed. That's it. That's the whole thing. And it took me 64 years and a Facebook notification to get there. There's a version of this story where I stay quiet, where I accept a few weeks without pushing back, where I write the check Brianna asked for, where I keep visiting twice a year and sleeping next to the treadmill and telling myself that this is just how adult children are now. I almost lived that version. For years, I was living it. And I want to be honest about why. Because I was afraid that if I said what was true, I would lose Trevor completely. So I said nothing, and I was losing him anyway. Just more slowly and with better manners. What I've learned, not as a philosophy, just as a fact I observed in my own life, is that silence doesn't preserve relationships. It just delays the reckoning. Every time I didn't tell Trevor that something hurt, I was making a small withdrawal from something I thought I was protecting. By the time Brianna called asking for money, the account was nearly empty, and I haven't even noticed it happening. The tricky thing about people who take more than they give is that they don't announce themselves. Brianna didn't call me the day after the wedding and say, "I intend to manage your access to your son and eventually ask you for money." It happened the way most gradual things happen, through small decisions, each one easy to rationalize, until one day you're sitting in your kitchen finding out your grandson was born through a neighbor's screenshot and you're still trying to figure out what you did wrong. I didn't do anything wrong. That took me a while to understand. I had confused being excluded with being at fault. What I did do, and this is the part I'd want any mother, any parent, any person in a relationship where they feel like a managed inconvenience to hear, is that I eventually chose honesty over comfort. Not cruelty, not punishment, just honesty. I told Trevor the truth about what his choices had cost me. I put it in writing so he couldn't misremember it or have it filtered through someone else. And I made practical decisions about my own life and my own assets that reflected reality rather than the relationship I wished we had. The thing about that is it requires a kind of courage I didn't know I had at 64. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that says, "I love you, and I will not pretend that what happened was acceptable." And both of those things are true at the same time. Trevor called me on a Tuesday just to tell me about a laugh. That's where we are now. It's not everything. But it's real, and it's ours, and we build it out of honesty instead of avoidance. That, I think, is what I'd want to pass on to my grandson someday. Not the property, not the cafe, not any of it. Just that. Tell the truth, even when it costs you something. Especially when it costs you something. Because the relationships that survive honesty are the only ones worth keeping.